Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, wherever you are. Thank you for joining today in this discussion paper series that we have been organizing on the discussion paper on the context and challenges for gender transformative work with men and boys. And welcome to the fifth of the session. And today we will be looking into more on the digital context, which is the chapter 5 of the discussion paper, looking more into media, attention economies, and the manosphere. If you are on social media, do follow us there, especially on Twitter. And if you are tweeting live, use the hashtag Ubuntu Symposium or Symposio Ubuntu so that you can get connected with the broader conversation that is happening in the social media platform as well. What we are trying to do today is to sort of look at this paper that I was referring to. And this paper basically seeks to sort of do a consolidated analysis of the landscape where the work on engaging boys and men transforming masculinities is located, and sort of seeks to spark a critical conversation on the political, economic, and socio-cultural forces we confronting the world today. Just a caution there is we do not claim to have answers to all the questions, but we try to raise questions so that we can actually start digging deeper in the context and what it means for the kind of work we are doing to transform or end patriarchy through our value addition that we bring as MenEngage in transforming patriarchal masculinities. So this paper is also available in English, Spanish, and French. If you go to this link, which appears on the lower end of your screen, tiny URL /MenEngage paper, you will be able to access that paper in three different languages. So as I also said before, so this is the fifth one in the series. The earlier ones, the fourth one, looking at the broad gender justice, the need for systemic change, was on 19th of January. And all of these 4 sessions are recorded and available in our YouTube channel. So if you would like to have a look on the previous conversations, feel free to do that. And today we are looking at the 5th one, which is the digital context, looking into more around the role of media, attention economies, and the manosphere, and what that means for the work we are doing on transforming patriarchal masculinities and work with boys and men. And how should we be attentive towards how the regressive forces are driving and using these spaces, and how can we be smart about it and be proactive. So today, what we really want to do, as we have been doing for the previous sessions as well, is to have a very political and candid conversation. And the conversation will obviously revolve around the key framework of the Ubuntu Symposium, which is around feminism, intersectionality, accountability, and so on, and have a very political and insightful conversation as we move forward. And what we also intend to do with the discussions today that we have lined up is to also make this conversation relevant to the current context, so that everyone can relate to the current context that we are in and make those interconnections with how this work, this effort, relates to what I am doing in my own context, and also obviously forward-looking. How do we really move forward despite of the challenges that we face in the current world order? And also, accessible. So many times also this paper, what we have heard from colleagues is that it's very academic. And what we want the conversation today is to be a little more accessible, so that the colleagues in the ground would also be able to understand and distill down the key messages from this conversation, so that it is understood widely and be able to use in the work that everyone is doing. So for that, we have an amazing speakers and experts lined up. So just to quickly introduce you to all of them. So first we have Sandra Acheng, who is a gender and ICT researcher, policy analyst, writer, and Wikimedian. She is the program manager at Woganet, In Uganda, she coordinates a caucus called Women ICT Advocacy Group that comprises organizations and individuals interested in ICT and gender issues to advocate for internet access for all. She advocates for integration of gender perspective in ICT policies and analysis. Threats to free expression in Africa, introduced by regulatory initiatives. Sandra is a Freedom House Code contributor, 2020 Global Network Initiative Internew Fellow, Internew Optima Fellow, and a 2020 Tala Fellow by Defenders, aimed at scaling human rights defenders in the digital age. We will put her detailed bio in the chat box following as well. So next, we have Suraya Shamali, who is currently the Executive Director of the Representation Project. An award-winning author and activist, she writes and speaks frequently on topics related to gender norms, inclusivity, social justice, free speech, sexualized violence, and technology. The former director and co-founder of Women's Media Center Speech Project, she has long been committed to expanding women's civic and political participation. Suraya is also the author of Race Becomes Her, The Power of Women's Anger, which has been translated into several languages and a contributor to multiple anthologies, most recently Free Speech in the Digital Age and Believe Me, How Trusting Women Can Change the World. Her work as a writer, activist, organizer, and leader is featured widely in media, books, and academic research. The next we have is Loke Nilsson, and Loke is from Denmark and has for the past decade been engaging with issue of gender equality and justice. Since 2015, he had shifted roles at gender equality organization Dare Gender, which aims to engage more men and boys in gender equality work and to promote transforming ideas of masculinity to prevent harms and violence. And harassment and violence. As a part of that work, Loke has been looking at the interconnection between gender and extremism and the growing exploitation and operation organizing the operations of digital platforms themselves. And then following, we have Alan Gregg, who is joining us as the lead author of the discussion paper that I was referring earlier, who is a gender specialist with more than 20 years of experience working on issues of masculinities, violence, and oppression in countries of Global South and Global North. Alan has published widely on these issues, authoring a range of curricula and toolkits for use for professional development, as well as programs and strategic thinking and planning processes. He is an experienced gender trainer and very well known to most of us who are especially in the field of transforming patriarchal masculinities in particular. He, as a co-founder of the New York-based Challenging Male Supremacy Project, he is committed to a vision of social justice with gender equality at its heart. So thank you all. And also to introduce myself, my name is Laxman Velva. I'm originally from Nepal. I work at the MenEngage Global Alliance as one of the two co-directors we have. And I have, and probably, and then also if you would like to use social media, the Twitter handles are in the screen as well. And we'll again post them in the chat box so that you have that. So without getting into more details, I would now like to hand it over to Alan to sort of give us a context and look at what this context in the discussion paper is all about and what that means and what is it in the paper that we have included and tried to include in sort of as a value addition to thinking on how can we make a work on transforming patriarchal masculinities and work with boys and men more political, and look at this kind of how both interpersonal and communication and public discourse and internet both reinforces and expands the operations of oppressive behavior and hierarchies and what that means in our context. Before I do that, we wanted to show you just 3 minutes clip of Laura Batts, who is author of book Everyday Sexism and then Initiative as well. And we'll just spend 3 minutes and then we'll hear from Alan. So we wanted to show you
or that Mike Pence, the Vice President of the United States, refuses to have dinner alone with any woman other than his wife. Then there are men's rights activists, perhaps the most acceptable face of the manosphere and the ones we're most likely to see in the news being given mainstream coverage because they pay lip service to very real issues affecting men, issues like the male mental health crisis, issues like veteran support, issues like male workplace injuries, but who actually devote their time and their energy to attacking and undermining women and feminism, to bringing lawsuits to try and defund women's sexual violence services. And one of these spurious lawsuits brought by a self-proclaimed men's rights activist lawyer in the States, which was against the male-only military draft, which is a real touch point for men's rights activists. And he didn't like the way that the judge handled it. Earlier this year, he turned up at her house and shot her son dead, and also shot her husband. So these are online ideologies, yes, but they're not niche, they're not tiny, they're not small groups of men who never come offline or meet. We're talking about men who, in the names of these ideologies, have come offline and committed real violence against women. We're talking about men who are deliberately grooming boys. What I found was that they don't just try to suck boys into their groups or forums directly, they're extremely clever. They use bodybuilding websites, which sounds odd until you realize that there is 10 times as much content on the average bodybuilding website I researched about the teen section than any other section. So it's a group that is ripe for the picking. You're looking for boys who are already anxious, concerned about particular ways of projecting a certain alpha male masculine image to the world. Bodybuilding websites are a very clever place to find them. They are grooming boys using gaming live streams when boys are in their bedrooms, in their own homes, but on their headsets and speaking over the internet to people they don't know. And they're very clever about using online social media like YouTube, for example. It might not sound like such a big deal until you learn that YouTube accounts for 37% of all mobile internet traffic, that it's by far the biggest social media platform used by young people, and that 70% of the videos viewed on YouTube are recommended by its algorithm. You know, the videos that pop up and tell you, try watching this next. So if you put those two stats together, you learn that a quarter of all mobile internet traffic anywhere in the world just consists of people watching the videos that YouTube has chosen.
I'll now hand it over to Alan.
Thanks, Laxman. And hello, everyone. Great to have you all with us for this fifth session around the discussion paper. Laxman's given you an overview of the discussion paper itself. Just to be clear about how it was created, it was based on a context analysis that I wrote as part of my support to the MenEngage Alliance's strategic planning process last year. And that context analysis grew out of interviews that I did with a range of stakeholders and key informants from different sectors and settings to inform the strategic planning process, as well as the MenEngage Alliance's Global Secretariat, staff and board. So what's in the paper is the product of many people's thinking and conversations. And I think the other important thing to say is that, as Laxman said earlier as well, what's presented in the paper is not intended as a comprehensive or academic overview of all the issues to do with digital technologies and masculinity and patriarchy, but it's intended to identify particular issues that the MenEngage Alliance and its members need to think about in terms of the work that they do out in the world. So it's meant to inform action and to draw out particular concerns and ways of thinking about the challenges digital technologies pose us that have direct implications for the work that MenEngage Alliance does. Next slide, please. And the paper has, you could say, 3 starting points. And apologies to people who've joined previous sessions, because the next couple of slides you will be familiar with, but it's just to orient people who are new to this discussion paper series. So a key starting point for the paper is that we need radical systems change. It's no longer sufficient to think about small scale projects. We need to be thinking much more broadly and with a bigger perspective on the change that's required. And in order to bring about that change, we really need to be clear about the obstacles and forces that are preventing progress towards gender justice, and be in a kind of continuing and deep conversation about how we understand those forces and obstacles. And related to that, then, to be clear about how our work is contributing to broader movements for social change and social justice. In other words, we're not going to make the progress we need to make on a thinking of it in terms of a kind of project by project work. We need to locate and connect our work to the work of many other organizations across the world who are, broadly speaking, trying to push for the changes that we are interested in. And it's through that mass effort that will bring about the change. This is a call for a radical transformation of a world in crisis. So this is from a strategy meeting that was held in late 2019, a feminist convening, preparing for the Generation Equality Forum. And they were very clear that we need to put women, people, and the planet over profit. And this notion that we're facing multiple and interconnected crises is brought out quite clearly in the paper. Next slide, please. And previous sessions and earlier chapters in the paper have looked at the different political, social, and economic contexts. The Women's Rights Caucus, which is the convening body that brings together civil society organizations at the UN, emphasizes the importance of identifying the neoliberal economic order as a key structural barrier obstructing progress, as I mentioned before, and needing to recognize the links between the rise of authoritarianism, fascism, nationalism, xenophobia, and supremacist ideologies, and fundamentalism. So to see the links between these forces as well. The Women's Rights Caucus made very clear that it was rejecting the actions of regressive groups who reinforce patriarchy, nationalism, fundamentalism, authoritarianism, and capitalism. So today we're going to be thinking about the ways in which digital technologies and forces are bound up with these sets of issues and forces that are named by the Women's Rights Caucus. And as Laxman's already said, that the chapter in the paper breaks these down into three major themes: media technologies and patriarchal masculinities, attention economies, and the rise of the manosphere. Next slide, please. So of course, media has long been an interest of gender justice work. Concerns about, the objectification of women in the media, the male gaze in film and TV. But what the paper argues is that this work on media needs to reckon with the explosive growth in digital technologies. Of course, there are lots of ways in which digital technologies are affecting our lives, not just to do with the media. The paper focuses on the media, partly for the sake of, we didn't have a lot of space to get into all the other issues that you might consider, not least in terms of the way the world of work is changing because of digital technologies. But I think the media is a particularly important aspect of this growth in digital technologies, not least because it's, we can think of the ways in which it's mediating or shaping all aspects of many people's lives now. Not just social life, as in social media, but social media is also a huge engine of economic growth and a medium of political dialogue, discourse, and policy making. So Twitter is now a major platform for political speech in many countries. People engage in economic activity through their mobile phones. So we need to think broadly and deeply about digital technologies and the ways in which they affect all aspects of our lives. And that means that people who do not have access to digital technologies are excluded from many aspects of social, economic, and political life. And the paper quotes some research on the ways in which women, and particularly women marginalized by poverty and other forces of social discrimination, still lack access to and control over digital media technologies. So this issue of digital exclusion as a major force of gender injustice is a significant problem. It's also being, I think, by now very, very well documented that digital technologies are a means of perpetrating gender-based violence, deepening already practices of gender-based violence and creating new forms of gender-based violence through the use of particularly mobile phones and digital technologies. So I think this notion that we need to be rethinking a clear line between on and offline worlds. These worlds increasingly blend into each other, as Laura Bates was saying. So harassment online can lead to physical violence offline. And we need to be thinking about the relations between these different forms of violence. And we also need to think about the political purposes being served by that violence. So I think you can look at the ways in which there's a lot of concern now about the growth of misogyny in public speech and the patriarchal backlash, which is taking many forms. One of the many forms it takes is through media technology, digital technologies. Online patriarchal backlash is now a significant feature of many societies, and often it's targeted at women or gender and sexual minorities who are trying to claim political rights. So I think we can think about oppression of marginalized and oppressed groups is now digital in many societies. Some research on abusive tweets in the UK found against politicians found an overwhelming number of those tweets were directed at a female and black politician in the Labour Party, Diane Abbott. Literally a significant proportion of all hostile tweets in the UK directed at politicians were directed at a black female politician. And I'm sure other speakers on this webinar can speak to similar experiences in other countries. Next slide, please. So as the UN Human Rights Council said in 2018, it's important to acknowledge that the internet is being used in a broader environment of widespread and systemic structural discrimination and gender-based violence. It frames their access to and use of the internet and other information and communication technologies. So emerging forms of ICT have facilitated new types of gender-based violence and gender inequality, which hinder women and girls' full enjoyment of their human rights and ability to achieve gender equality. So again, this needed to think about on and offline being blended in the experience of violence and oppression. Next slide, please. And increasingly, there's work being done to think about the ways in which, when we talk about information, we need to be clear about the purposes of information sharing on digital media. This is a great quote from a wonderful book called The Twittering Machine, which is looking at the explosive growth in social media and its effects on social, economic, and political life. As Richard Seymour writes, on social media platforms, the incentive is to constantly produce more information, a perpetual motion machine harnessed to passions of which the machine knows nothing. But the production of this information is not for the purpose of making meaning, it's for the purpose of producing effects on users that keep us hooked. So I think when we usually talk about information and communication, we're often thinking about we're communicating with other people in order to create shared meanings. And that's certainly an important feature of the work that we all do with men and boys on patriarchal masculinities. We are sharing information, we're communicating to men and boys about issues of gender and masculinity and patriarchy and power to create shared meanings. But the platforms, their business model works in terms of the purpose of the information is not to create shared meaning so much as to keep us hooked online. So it's to keep our attention. And I think the image there that you saw on the previous slide is interesting, because I think a lot of the discussion around attention economies, certainly in the global north, is often premised on this view of users being online individually. So they're on their phones or they're at home with their personal computers. And of course, in many parts of the world, that isn't people's experience. Although mobile phone usage is growing rapidly, many people still access the internet in shared spaces, like this iHub in Kenya. So it's interesting to think about attention economies in relation to not just isolated individuals and being hooked on their phones, but also the kind of mixed attention of being hooked on the internet, but in a communal space. And I think that it's useful to think about that in terms of the work that we might do. So attention economies is the second aspect of the paper, and it's kind of rethinking this idea that information is about meaning. No, it's about attention. Platform capitalism makes money from us by keeping us hooked on our screens, extracting data about us, which then gets sold to advertisers who sell things to us. So the whole business model is based on our attention being maintained. And platform capitalism is producing a massive concentration of power, the likes of which I don't think the world has ever seen before. And I think when we think about the work that we're doing to try and challenge the impact of digital technologies on patriarchy and masculinity, we need to think about these concentrations of power that we're dealing with. So I've just finished reading a book about Amazon in the UK, in the US, the company Amazon, and the ways in which it has more or less taken over many aspects of the US economy, with widespread impacts on US politics as well. So this is what we need to be clear when we're naming the obstacles. We need to be clear about this is what we're dealing with. And what we're dealing with is a business model of platform capitalism that is about keeping our attention and extracting our data. And it's clear that a great way to keep our attention is to share and distribute and create provocative / oppressive content, because that's what people react to. So a study that's quoted in the paper looks at the contribution that they reckoned President Trump's offensive, racist, misogynist tweets had made to literally Twitter's profit margins. And it's some significant percentage of Twitter's profits could be traced back to the volume of tweets that were created by former President Trump's, glad I can use that expression, former President Trump's tweets. So the understanding that what the oppressive speech that we're dealing with online is not just connected to the bad behavior of bad people, it's intimately linked to the business models of major corporations. There's a reason why Twitter and others were very, very slow to remove offensive content and oppressive content from their platforms, because they know it's good for business. The other problem we're dealing with is the rise of disinformation. So we have a problem of information, we have a problem of disinformation. Of course, we've always had problems with what got characterized as fake news. If you grew up in the UK in the 70s, as I did, you grew up with lots of fake news in the tabloid newspapers, which still exists. But I think the problem here is the massive growth in not only the sharing of false facts, but this pervasive sense that we no longer know where the true facts are, or how the true facts might be verified or agreed upon. So it's not so much a crisis of false news or fake news as a crisis of knowing. And I think this has significant implications for gender justice work, because a lot of the work that we do is sharing correct information, that gender is not biologically based, It's not genetically determined, it's socially constructed. Well, one of the problems with the crisis of knowing linked to digital disinformation is that discussions about this is right and this is wrong, or this is true and this is false, are so much harder to have now because of this crisis of knowing. And I think it's significant that the rise of online conspiracy theories, much of that is linked to an anti-feminist ideology. So as we'll go on to see, much of the energy behind the manosphere is linked to this notion that actually what men have been told about by feminists about the problems of gender injustice, that gender injustice affects and targets women or gender and sexual minorities, is in fact false, that the main victims of gender conditioning are men. So this notion that feminism is a conspiracy is linked to this problem of disinformation online. Next slide, please. This is a great quote by Debbie Ging, who looks at the ways in which these particular aspects of digital technologies could be seen to fuel patriarchal masculinity. So she writes, the technological affordances, which means the technological aspects of social media, such as speed, anonymity, platform algorithms, those recommendation algorithms that Laura Bates mentioned, and social disembodiment, facilitate new and different ways in which to assert male hegemony. So the ways in which these patriarchal masculinities that we're concerned about are kind of built into digital technologies themselves. Next slide, please. And a lot of this comes together in what Laura referred to as the manosphere. When I just found this image of this book, when I first saw it, I thought it was a parody or a satire, but it's actually a real book, which claims that the manosphere is a way to revalorize masculinity. So there's mention there of the red pill. So the red pill is this notion that, linked to the Matrix movies, that we're laboring under this illusion of male domination of women, but so we need to take the red pill and see through to the truth that men are oppressed by women. So the manosphere is an online ecology of sites, memes, and message boards, organized and energized by narratives of feminism's oppression of men and the rejection of the evidence of men's patriarchal oppression of women. And it would be interesting to hear from the speakers, but also you, the participants, as to what extent the manosphere, which I think still has quite a North American and European feel to it, to what extent people in other parts of the world are connecting, to what extent it's a transnational phenomenon and how it travels to other parts of the world. So the manosphere has roots, as Laura Bates suggested, in long histories of men's rights movements and anti-feminism. I think we also need to situate it in relation to the kind of organizational culture of tech industries in Silicon Valley and elsewhere, which are well documented in terms of their misogynistic masculinism. Laura Bates talked about the grooming that goes on online. I think what's significant to think about is the ways in which the online message boards and listservs, etc., that comprise the manosphere, they're places where community building happens. So it's a sites for anti-feminist community building, and the significance of emotions of anger and anxiety that are central to that community building is important that we reckon with. Not least because I think if we need to take action against the manosphere, we need to be thinking about ways of building alternative communities. I think we also need to be paying attention to the ways in which anger and anxiety around heterosexuality and men's heterosexuality in particular drives and keeps many men, particularly young men, on these sites. So the personal is political is obviously a feminist mantra from the 70s, thinking about the ways in which personal practices of patriarchal behaviors have political effects. in the home, in the street, in the workplace, and the manosphere is a part of that. So the misogynistic speech and the practices they lead to have real world effects in many women's lives. But you can go all the way up to this kind of quite intimate conversations that men are having online about their sexual frustrations. And some of those conversations come together in what's called incel forums, incel standing for involuntary celibates. So men are coming to those sites to talk about their frustrations and anger about their inability to have sex with women, and the sense of frustrated, or as Michael Kimmel says, aggrieved entitlement. But these incel forums have also been connected to a number of incidents of mass killings, where men in US, Canada, and elsewhere have gone out and killed a number of people, usually women, and linked that to their belonging to or beliefs about the incel ideology, as Laura described it. So this personal to political link is also a kind of micro to macro link. If you think about the violence that's perpetrated, it's not just, we should be careful not to kind of psychologize the violence too much. It's violence with real world political effects and often political purposes. There's also been a lot of concern and research done looking at the ways in which the manosphere is a gateway to other forms of political practice, notably on the far right. So a lot of the manosphere's discussion of disrupted gender orders, that men have no longer have their rightful place in the gender order. It's often racialized. So it appeals to white men and their sense of loss of power and authority, and discussions around the needing to reclaim that authority is often about reasserting white power as well as male power. And I think you can see that happening in the US and many parts of Europe. But again, be interesting to hear from other people how that travels to other parts of the world. Next slide, please. So as this report from the Institute for Research on Male Supremacism, which I recommend people check out, makes clear, misogynist incels are often perceived as a movement without political aims. Violent perpetrators who claim allegiance to this incel ideology do have the same type of far-reaching aims that white nationalists have. So again, we have this link between the far right and the manosphere, to completely change the culture and politics of society to favor their own group. So a clear message from this report is that we need to be thinking about the incel phenomenon as a political and ideological phenomenon, which we need to take seriously. But it also cautions that we also need to kind of situate this incel community or communities in relation to broader currents of misogyny and male supremacism, and not to treat it as almost like this exotic expression of these underlying ideologies around male supremacism. It's just one manifestation. So the focus only on incels obscures the extent to which male supremacism and misogyny animates beliefs and violence outside their specific movement. So it's an extreme manifestation of a mainstream misogyny that we're dealing with in many cases. So what does all this mean for us? This will be the last slide. So it means that we need to be, as a big theme of the whole discussion paper, is that we need to be connecting our work in MenEngage with broader movements, and we need to be certainly connecting with movements for digital gender justice that are working on these issues of exclusion and violence and digital oppression, and also challenging the concentrations of power in platform capitalism. I think we also need to be taking more seriously digital safety issues in our own work online. Online platforms are surveillance infrastructures for corporations and states alike. So as we get into more areas of more contentious political organizing, then that does have implications for how we think about our own safety in our communications. The big theme again of the paper is that we need to be showing up as allies much more explicitly, and there is a debate about the ally framework and how it applies to the MenEngage Alliance's work, but we certainly need to be, as a collective, stepping up more visibly and publicly to challenge this online oppression. And I think the MenEngage Alliance has a role to play in kind of building skills of our members to do that. I think this issue of sexuality and male heterosexuality and anger and anxiety in relation to that, which draws particularly young men into the Manosphere and other forms of male supremacist digital spaces. We need to be thinking about what we can do to be developing work around that, which becomes alternative forms of community building. So think back to that picture of the iHub. It wasn't just men. I think there was one woman in the picture, but it's mostly men. They're both online and offline at the same time. They're on their screens, they're on their computers, they're also talking to each other about what they're looking at online. So this notion that there's a crisis of knowing, we need to be thinking about the ways that we can be building trusted communities of knowing, where these male supremacist ideologies can be challenged, and visions and ideas around gender justice promoted. So I'll leave it there and look forward to the conversation with all the discussants. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Alan. Great. So yeah, I think let's move on to the next section, where we would invite three of our speakers together. So to our colleagues who are supporting with the IT to sort of spotlight all three of them now. And while doing that, just wanted to highlight that even though digital technology has brought some very unprecedented opportunities for transnational activism and social justice movement building, as we have seen during the time of COVID situation, and we right now organizing this online conversation as a part of the broader movement building ideology and process, as well as keeping the climate in mind so that we don't travel across too much and exploiting the climate and taking care of the planet. However, the growing influence of media and online space in all aspects of everyday life and political debate, including expressions and experiences of patriarchal masculinities, means that we need to be more smart enough and relative to the feminist agenda of systems change, and those working on transforming masculinities and work with boys and men need to identify ourselves more and more in this broader movement building approach. So with that, I think what we now intend to do between Suraya, Sandra, and Luke is to sort of have a conversation among three of you on what you just heard. Does it resonate with the work and the space you are in? What do you think the problem we need to look at is confronting to make the work even more political? But anything missing that you would like to add on to what is there in the paper? And how relevant is it in your own context and the work you all are doing? And what are the key messages that you would leave us with for those who are in this field or area of work on work with boys and men, looking at transforming patriarchal masculinities? And we intend to be as a candid conversation among three of you, and I'll also definitely contribute. So yeah, whoever would like to start, over to you three now.
Well, I'll jump in. Mm-hmm. Ever uncomfortable with silences and eager to fill them. I appreciate the report very much. It brings together a lot of work, I think, in a way that I don't want to use the word more palatable, but in fact, in a way that makes it more palatable, because I think the topic is really quite ugly. It's very difficult to fathom for most people that the men who are populating these spaces are not outlier extremists. And I think this is really important. The kinds of hostility and denigration that we see on these platforms trades in the easy and casual acceptance of denigration of women broadly, and makes it quite straightforward to justify in a lot of these spaces this behavior of women and sometimes criminal activity or intensification of offline abusive behaviors as a means of self-defense. What you see in a lot of these spaces is the idea that women are responsible for economic despair and moral corruption and hurt and pain and selfishness, and that justifies this treatment that we see. I will encourage people to look at Debbie Ging's book, which I can share, to look at Laura Bates's book, which was recently published. There's another book called Gender Trolling, all of which talk about this work. And it's, I think what Laura talks about, I think is important in that she's been able to document the scope of it, the scope of participation. But I want to add too that those spaces, the incel spaces, the pickup artist, they're actually, even though they're sprawling and interconnected in amorphous ways, they're a specific thing that is separate from the institutional hostility towards women and, depending on your context, minoritized people that exist in the technology sector itself, and that exists not just as a function of what's being shared on these platforms, but in the structure of the platforms, the data structure of the platforms, the engineering of the platforms themselves as hyper masculinized spaces that produce an inherent hostility to people who don't start off in a safe physical space, who don't start off with power, who don't start off with this idea that you either have safety or you have free speech. That's a luxury. For most of us, our free speech is tied to our lack of safety to begin with. And so positing that juxtaposition inherently assumes that you have this kind of protective space, and that to allow other people to speak freely somehow hurts you specifically, because there's this competing value between the freedom and the free speech, when in fact that doesn't exist in a lot of cases. And so I don't want to just focus on this sort of idea that there are these outlier spaces on the internet. I'm hoping that Sandra can talk about this. I've done a lot of work with Wikipedia too, but it's a pretty good example of the way subtle hostility and norms and standards can produce a kind of exclusionary and often denigrating experience for people who don't fit the norm, which is still remarkably calibrated to a sort of European descent young white man who populates the leadership of so many of these spaces.
Thank you, Soraya. Sandra, you want to add on to what Soraya was just,
Yeah, so thank you so much for the opportunity. I just want to add on what Shoya said. So yeah, the report is really very detailed and brings out a lot of issues, especially in the fight of gender equality. So for me, reading this report really gave me the understanding that while we advocate for women's rights online, we also need to understand that it's also threatening a lot of progress on the women's and girls' rights, and also the gender justice more. So for us, like at Women of Uganda Network, we always ensure that as we are doing our research, we are doing studies, we are doing a lot of analysis, we ensure that we use the gender evaluation methodology approach to ensure that the gender perspective is being integrated. And also, while also reading the report, I realized that there's really a lot of existing inequalities of power between men and women, boys and girls. So how do we then ensure that we narrow these gaps between the men, women, boys and girls? Because already when we say that inclusion, we tend to see that we start even with the men and we bring the women later. How do we then ensure that while we include women when we include the fight for inclusion of gender equality, also men is being included?
Okay.
Yes, thank you. I always wait so someone hands me the word. I'm like a vampire. I need to be invited in first. So yes, I have praise for the report as well. I think it's an important contribution to sort of bind trends together at the moment, and I think this is something that I really admire the MenEngage Alliance for in general, that we get this more global perspective, and that's also why it's nice to be here today, because I'm already sensing that we are experiencing the same thing from different angles across the world. And I think that's an important point in itself, how these trends, these backlash, because I think we can safely say that we're talking about a global backlash against what I would call progressive gender politics, against feminism, against women's rights, minority rights, and I guess in a sense also I wouldn't call it a right, but in men's ability to digress or move away from traditional patriarchal gender norms. And this is something we see globally. In Europe, we see it. We've seen it in Poland. We've seen it recently or we are seeing it in Poland. We've seen it recently in Turkey as well, and we're seeing it at home here in Denmark, of course. But I think we're seeing slightly different things. So one thing, and especially to what Soraya was saying, the influence of the manosphere. I think it's interesting to look at the influence the manosphere is having on the mainstream. The way, especially memes are migrating, the way words like incel, like red pilled, and so on, are migrating from more fringe corners of the internet or the offline space to more mainstream, to high school classes, school classes, and politics. We also have in Denmark, we have mainstream politicians who are adopting languages that 5-10 years ago would really make you raise your eyes, but today they are becoming more normal. Languages about the rights of men, language about men being excluded from politics, from political spaces, and so on and so on. So we are seeing this. But what I find interesting, and what I hope we can discuss today about the manosphere and its influence. So I normally distinguish between two types of sort of ways of looking at gender and extremism. There are the groups who have gender as sort of an object of extremism. Here I include the most groups in the manosphere. You have the incels, you have the men going their own way. All these groups who say gender, that's our focus, that's our main object, that's where we get our anger from. And then you have all the groups who have gender as sort of an indirect object of their extremism, where it's a foundational element of their ideologies. You have the neo-Nazis, you have the Salafists, you have all these movements. And why I make this distinction is I think it's different from country to country how this plays out, and it's different how these groups work together. If you look at the last group, the indirect group, the Nazis and so on, most of them, they, as I see it in Europe at least, they look at the manosphere and gain a lot of good ideas from the manosphere, but they don't like them. Essentially, they don't like them. Incel is generally viewed as a bad word, as a bad thing to be, as a loser identity. They are looking at a whole different kind of politics, a more a family a politics of reproduction, taking back control of women's bodies, and so on and so on. So it's a different thing, and seen from a Scandinavian perspective, I would say that's what I'm worried about here. That's what we're seeing, because that's the form of politics that's slowly entering mainstream politics. For example, the theory of the Great Replacement that many of you probably know, the idea that immigrants are coming to replace a certain ethno-national group, and the way gender, of course, plays heavily into this. Because what is the solution to the Great Replacement for these groups? It is taking back the control of reproduction. That means heavily limiting the rights of women, and it means reinserting like extreme heteronormativity, the binary, at the detriment of the LGBT plus population, of course, because they are seen as another obstacle to the idea of the ethno-state. So that's where I really see some problems. But I'm sure Soraya and Sandra can also talk about how these ideas connect with the other ideas as well. So I think this distinction can be important, and it can be guiding in how we look at things. Another thing, and then I'll round up, is that I was thinking about when reading the report or reading this chapter, is what we mean by digital spaces, and where we are exactly thinking about these people are moving, and how they are moving. So I think, and here I'm putting myself on the line, I think sometimes we also involuntarily have to, or not, but we have to admit our lack of understanding of how the internet actually works and how people move on the internet. That's always my problem. I'm a nature person. I like to be out, not inside. So I have a insanely limited understanding of how the internet works. And I think that's also, we talk about a lot about YouTube, we talk a lot about all these things, but slowly I think these platforms are becoming obsolete. Now we have to talk about BitChute, we have to talk about Gap, we have to talk about all these new spaces. And that's also a thing, it's constantly evolving. It's not just about big tech, it's also about how you can create alternative communities on online, how you can use the dark web to not only exchange ideas but exchange content, like very some of the worst content imaginable. So I think that's also one of the problems, from my side at least, that we have an emergent understanding of the digital space, and this we need to take into account when we use the same framework as we're used to using when we deal with gender issues, to look at the digital space. That's it from my side. Thanks.
Can I add something
Yes.
to that? Because I agree with that. I mean, we haven't talked, for example, at all about gaming or pornography, right? And those are two vectors for the recruitment of young men in particular into these spaces. And there are particular political ideologies that align, that manifest themselves in these areas. I think that what I'd like to talk about is that the logic of the porn industry online is the logic of all of these platforms right now. The sense that you are the product, you are what's being sold, your data and information, an engagement model that trades on extremism. I mean, forget the actual content of pornography and how people may feel about pornography, but the actual engagement logic and profit model that was established as the earliest and most successful implementation of the internet, right? And the porn industry is always at the cutting edge of new technologies. And so now, you know, with absolutely zero civic or political or consumer input or insight, that is moving entirely, has moved into a virtual world that is increasingly going to be literally biological, right? Like the way that people engage with that kind of content will be a next order of technology. And so I think that when we think about how people get exposed, how they form communities, what they're seeing, all of those spaces are important to consider. And then the other thing too is we don't think of boys in terms of a type of sociality that is lonely. So boys use gaming to come together and to form communities. And I have been in some of these spaces, frankly, quite accidentally. In one case that was quite illuminating, a group of young men decided to harass women feminist speakers on maybe International Women's Day, and started a group chat and included us all for the purposes of sharing stupid memes. And most of the women left, and I didn't. I stayed for months. And what happened in that space were these young men, and Laura talks about this in her book. She did this. She deliberately was undercover in these spaces. You know, they're very young. They're talking about homework. They're talking about skateboards. They're talking about games. And then all of a sudden, a few months in, there was a voice that literally dropped the rape of a 6-year-old girl for entertainment into the conversation. And some of the boys responded with silence. Some of them responded with cool. Some of them, only one actually, said it was horrifying. But that's the kind of communication that's happening that adults don't think about, right? A Twitter DM, a gaming chat. We're not talking about kids who are going to spaces and deliberately trying to seek out those types of communities. The second thing that I wanted to add to what Loki said was, I think that the backlash we're seeing is global, and it's clearly tied to rising authoritarian tendencies all over the world. And you can't separate those two things. A white supremacist movement is a male supremacist movement, right? Like that those two are mutually constructive in every capacity that is meaningful for what we're talking about right now. And so we also have the problem of how media represent these problems. You know, and it's very hard in the United States, for example, to get media to marry those things in analysis of what's happening. To just have a headline that uses the word supremacist is difficult. To have one that says white supremacist is maybe easier today than it was 7 years ago. But to have one that says white male supremacist movements is still virtually impossible. And those movements are global. When Anders Breivik killed, you know, dozens of people, his manifesto included all of the ethno-nationalist, white supremacist information that people wrote about, but it centrally included anti-feminist, anti-progressive sort of rationalization for what he was doing. And that went online and became a Bible for copycat killers everywhere. And so we can't really underplay the national quality, the international quality of these networks, because women who are targeted as individuals, women politicians and women media makers, are expected to somehow deal with this as individuals. And if they're encouraged to go to law enforcement, it's inadequate because they can only really go to their local jurisdiction. There's no remediation. It's a transnational remediation other than going to these companies. And people like me as advocates who have pushed against these companies understand that that is pyrrhic at best, really, like despite years of doing that work. And so I think understanding that while the problems may start in small spaces of the home, of small communities, they in fact have their efflorescence and power in the scope and scale of these transnational networks. And that can't be underestimated. I mean, a woman politician in Kenya or India or England is literally being harassed by men in the United States or Australia or South Africa. And what is she supposed to do with that? She's fighting both. She's fighting a multi-front war in terms of misinformation, disinformation, public perception, and her own exercise of free speech.
Exactly. Yeah, couldn't agree more. I think, you know, all these spaces are so connected, and and we see that sort of tripling down across and becoming more of an online in transnational solidarity groups. And Laura also talks about, you know, her experience on when she was visiting these schools in the rural areas in the UK, how these young men were using the same language, exact same language, being sort of pushed into their brains and minds and brainwashed with these ideologies of around gender and the language which was sort of against the whole idea of feminism and gender equality and so on. And she was quite surprised. And we've seen that. I have seen that. When I was in Sweden, I also saw how internet was being used by ISIS groups to call these young people from the Europe region into joining ISIS, and there were a number of mobilizations that were happening. But again, sort of the language they use is such a sexist language that really reinforces and builds on to the stereotypical gender norms on related to who they are, their own identities, their roles in terms of their identities as nationalism, or sort of those who are oppressed by the same ideology of gender equality and so on. And then all the way to South Asia, where I'm from, I have seen young people connected with these online groups, even though they are not organized in Nepal in a particular way, but they are interacting with these groups online and through various ones. And And also, as Suraya, you talked about, the gaming industry is becoming another big platform for these groups to really outreach young boys from the very early age, looking into. And I keep on discussing with my own child as well, and he keeps on giving me these insights which I had no clue of. And to the point, okay, how these systems are evolving is pretty amazing. The way they are smart in sort of utilizing different spaces to reach out and bombard with the same kind of stereotypical masses on these minds of young people. But also, one way to look at young people, but also it attracts young adult men as well in most cases. So I think it's not about generational, but also it's intergenerational, and how that impacts the whole norms around what it means to be a man and masculinities, and sort of reinforcing hyper-masculine ideologies on these young people. And Sandra, anything you would like to add before we move on to, because sorry, you were dropped off for a moment there. Move on to the next stage.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so sorry, also I got some bit of disruption from here, so I had to just without notification. So also just wanted to add on what Shoya and Loka said, that from the Ugandan perspective, I think was a lot of socialization of course, young men into the masculine, and this has affected a lot of online discussions, usage, to create and share information. And then you realize that, of course, from the Uganda perspective, you realize that on the online platform, there's really increased rate of online gender-based violence. That is really limited in a lot of women's and girls' participation into the public and private sphere. And you realize that in most of these cases is that when we are looking at women and girls, we realize that most times we tend to only include the women, and yet also it's very important to include the men in advocating and for finding out the spread, the impacts, and the types of gender-based violence that exist in our communities. So that is also what I wanted to talk about. So there's a lot of harassment, attacks against women, against girls, but we tend to leave out the perpetrators themselves, and we tend to involve the victim. It's very important when we look at this, involve everyone. And I like that aspect that really this has also changed my chapter, has really changed my thinking, my perspective. But also, of course, as Women of Uganda Network, we're already involving men in our work by doing 70% of women and 30% of men in all our activities, training, research. Because when we research on online gender-based violence, we also need to get a perspective of men. What do they think about the issues that are affecting women online? So that is also something that we need to look into. And then also, of course, recognizing that as we use that create, share, and engage meaningfully, we also need to recognize that when I share my data online, data could be your name, your date of birth, your picture, or anything online. There are also people, or the social media platforms themselves, who are just waiting to extract and also exploit this information. And you realize that a lot of people, especially in Uganda, they really do not know that, oh, this is actually bad. Oh, when I share my picture with my partner and they share it without my consent, is not a problem. And so we need to create a lot of awareness and understanding of some of these issues around a digital context. And also, just as Loke said, that we really need to understand what does it mean to a layman here in the rural areas in Uganda, and someone also in the semi urban areas in Uganda, just to understand some of these issues. Recently, we have been doing a lot of awareness creation on data protection and privacy of vulnerable groups, the women, the person with disability. When you're going to collect data, what do you need to do? What do you need to do to store those data? Are you having the consent form? How are you going to use that data? Because sometimes this data tend to even end on and is being misused in their own ways. So those are some of the things that I wanted to add on before we go to the next discussion. Thank you.
Absolutely. I think that's such an important point. And with regards to the way the states, the nations are using these data, personal data, to sort of control their population in the very political sense. And I think the surveillance system that is then put around on a particular population is hugely sexist and gendered. And I think that's such an important element to consider, looking at how the certain systems, the online systems are shaped, as Suraya, you were mentioning, is the way they are structured in a way result into creating these structures of inequalities and in impact that we need to really consider and keep in our mind. And the growing influence of media and the online space on all aspects of our everyday life, let alone the political debate that happens. And we've seen that, including the expressions and experiences around patriarchal masculinities, means that feminist systems change agenda is actually is necessarily concerned with gender transformative work on media system itself. And that brings around what we keep on trying to now bring more upfrontly in the work with boys and men, is that this work needs to be connected with the feminist systems change agenda broadly. And I think also in the effort to act in solidarity with and in accountability to the radical systems change, as the women's group that convened in Mexico Forum tried to highlight, and also LGBTIQ movement, I think the whole deconstructing the gender binary operation of these systems is extremely important. And this should involve gender transformative work with boys and men that also identify ways in which it can contribute to movement critiques of gender injustice produced by the platform capitalism. So I think this really moves us to then, yes, we have this understanding, we have these ideas and information, we have these books written, we have certain levels of theory that have been produced now. But then what is then practically can we do? So the questions for the audience also is to then, if you feel free to put it in the chat box so that we can tap onto it, is how should MenEngage Alliance? So when we say MenEngage Alliance member, we also mean everyone who are doing the work on working with boys and men or transforming patriarchal masculinities, move from this problem analysis into practical actions. What is it that we can do practically? And that's what we will now do with also the discussions, is to really move into what is it that we need to focus, and now more focusing on how should we organize, what is it that we need to do, and how should the contextual analysis that we all discussed about should inform the strategies among those who are in this area of work. And also how can we be more effective in responding to the issues and questions raised by the chapter, and what do you think practically we need to immediately start thinking? So again, a conversation among three of you, and anything you would like to, and whoever like to start.
I can go first this time.
Go ahead.
One thing actually the conversation before made me think about is this way, and this is not really a very deep point or anything. This is what feminists and women have been saying for decades, but our language, the way our language work, the words we use, the way we talk. I mean, language around especially women is still, I would say, almost a training ground for hatred. It is a safe place to go where you can exercise misogyny, exercise hatred. And that's of course relevant when we look at this, when we look at extremism, when we look at online behavior, because when we look at extremism has this idea that you are diverging from some norm, you're diverging from something that's normal, and you're entering a moral space that we as a society will not allow. But when it comes to gender, the question is, when do you enter that space? That boundary becomes pushed. And I think my idea would be to say then our ability to identify when you cross that boundary is also it's more difficult to us to say, when do you cross that boundary? With us here, I mean, as whatever society you're in, because many jokes, many ways of communication are just allowed, normalized, and so on and so on. So there is a continuous work in simply just saying everything cannot be acceptable. We need to raise the bar for what is acceptable to say and express. And then I will contradict myself by saying, but we also need to be careful in doing that, because especially in working with young people, I would still say that young people like myself, like most of you probably, grow up in a sexist culture. So the language that you have when you're young, when you need to test your language, and not only when you're young, we all have certain languages, certain way of speaking. When you need to test culture, identity, push boundaries, is a sexist language. And I have to say that some of the reports I'm reading in Denmark and other places, where they just take a quote from whatever chat forum, and yes, it's a sexist quote, and yes, people should not say this, and yes, people should be engaged in a dialogue. But again, where is the boundary? When do we call it extremism? Because like the example you mentioned, Soraya, I think that's a very good example on so many levels, because it both testify to the extreme levels of whatever we call that situation. Do we call it humor? Do we call it, I mean, do we just call it interaction? What do we call that? It is extreme, but also the way of reacting. And also what you said, Sandra, something that I think we also need to understand is, how is it that men socialize, both online and offline? Like this thing with communication. Why is it that communication needs to be taken to these extreme levels? Why is it that men push each other like that? Try to stimulate whatever it is they want to have out of it. And how can you encourage what is commonly referred to as killjoys? You know, this idea that someone is saying something transgressive, someone is saying something sexist, misogynist. How can you have a male culture for saying no in a male space? And that's not only online; that's also in workplaces. How can you generate this idea of allyship that doesn't necessarily mean to step in a space with more genders, but in the male space? How can you encourage that? That's something that I myself find extremely difficult still, although actively working with this, because you are breaching a very specific masculine trust. And if you breach that, or masculine way of socialization, and if you breach that, there can be some, I'm not saying like violent repercussion or anything, but you can really, you enter a very vulnerable space there. So I think that would be my two things, the language, the discourse, how we talk about extremism, what we consider extreme, and then how do we intervene even in the very personal space, in the communal space.
Yeah, just to add on what Locke said, I think socialization is really a big thing that engaging men at gender equality, because already right at birth, men already been socialized with certain traits that are supposed to behave like this. They're supposed to behave in a certain way. They have this, they are strong, women are weak, and all that. So you tend to see that with all this, when you go onto the online space, this same kind of threat is then being shifted into the online space. So for me, moving forward, it's just, I think, as I read in the report for MenEngage, is really to start thinking of how do we then start having positive fatherhood programming, especially to change that mindset that, yes, like a woman can also be like this, a man can also be like this. I know that most of the men will look at this as an attack, maybe on their being masculine, but then also like women taking over. But then for us to achieve equality, some of these things really need to be dismantled. And then also, I think, of course, I know already the MenEngage already have the alliance, but also like we have also the Digital Human Rights Lab that is based in Uganda, that have a community of practice that brings different organizations with different experts to come together to advocate for a cause. For example, gender transformative justice, which is really something you can look at. So for the community that is based in Uganda, we have 5 community of practice that talks about different things: digital security, gender inclusion, and all that. So I think that is also something that we should start looking at. Mm-hmm. But also, I think also starting to also transform men's attitudes and behavior. For me, while I was pursuing my bachelor degrees at Makerere University, you could realize that as we were going to the second semester, we were going to study gender and development, and realized that most of the men would really like say that gender and development is for women, and then they couldn't take up the course. So how do we really change their mindset to start embracing courses that can change their mindset, change their thinking? And this really starts right from birth. And that is why it's very important. First step is to foster positive fatherhood, motherhood programming to bring men and women in a perspective that is also, when we engage online, will also be good for narrowing the gender that exists online. And then, of course, building stronger networks, partnership. Actually, for me, I didn't know about it. I'm really happy that now I have got to know about it. And I also realized there's actually MenEngage Uganda, which I didn't know about. For the Ugandans, I knew only one organization that was working around masculinity, which I'm very proud of. So building more networks, engaging more women's movement, to also engage men, boys in their work is important, because also you realize that when you're talking about women's issues, we sometimes also see that we are talking about women's issues, but to us, where are the men? So we need to start involving the men in this discussion, and clearly also state roles and the responsibility each gender is supposed to do in dismantling patriarchy in our work. Yeah, and then also I wanted to talk about the aspect of objectification of women and girls. Of course, this is kind of related to the online gender-based violence, the non-consensual intimate sharing of images online that has led to increased online harassment, especially among journalists and women politicians in Uganda. So I think also as the media, we really need to start, of course, it comes in a little bit of censorship, but what are we sharing out there? Does this really portray the woman that you're trying to, what if it's your sister? What if it's your mother? So we really need to start having those discussions. And also we really need to, as women's rights activists, we all not need to look at tackling the patriarchy, but then how do we then have men involved in narrowing the gender digital divide online? Yeah, that is all I wanted to say.
So I was listening carefully to both of you and taking notes on this card, because you had lots of good ideas and I didn't want to forget them while I was speaking, because I think they're all related. One thing that really strikes me is that we need to, I would encourage people to think about gender as it pertains to individuals, which we're talking about in terms of socialization, and interrelationships in terms of socialization, but also to think about how it operates structurally and politically in institutions. So if you think about a man like Donald Trump, during his tenure as president, the entire polity was engaged in like a dysfunctional intimate relationship at scale. He treated citizens, he treated the country, he treated our institutions in the ways, the power and control dynamics that you see at intimate levels, right? So the dismissal, the gaslighting, the persistent abuse, the denial, the sort of, I can get away with this and you can't leave. All of those dynamics can be mapped onto a power and control sort of domination that we think of globally as a masculinist way of acting, right? And that's where governance comes in. That's where the understanding gender at that scale really matters, because in essence, the way to dominate anyone is to feminize them, right? That's what mass incarceration of Black men is about. That's what, you know, sequestering Indigenous people in spaces and containing them is about. They lose their efficacy and their power and their autonomy and their ability to destine, you know, have a future. And so understanding the way gender operates structurally and not just interpersonally and personally, I think is super important. The second thing is that in that context, we, I think, have had 40 years of women entering public space and joining institutions. When people say, you know, she works in a male-dominated institution, I laugh, because I'm like, what institution is not a male-dominated institution, except maybe the few that are extensions of motherhood, nursing, teaching, you know, proto-maternal functions. And so all of these institutions essentially said, okay, fine, we'll have some women, but they need to act like us and be like us and do what we do. And that has failed, because when women go into these spaces, we actually take our vulnerabilities with us. And then those vulnerabilities, which require a different assessment of risk and threat and safety and what's important to public life, then become the vulnerabilities of institutions like media and politics. But the standards haven't changed. So if you think about misinformation and disinformation, very often sexualized memes and non-consensual sexual imagery that's being used to denigrate a woman politician, that doesn't count as disinformation or misinformation. And frankly, it doesn't, because media and political institutions don't have the experience of that happening to men and having it be a problem. So when in the US, Nancy Pelosi was pictured slurring her words, everybody went apeshit, because all of a sudden they're like, well, what happens if politicians are portrayed doing and saying things they never did and said? Deep fakes are going to destroy life. But in fact, it wasn't a deep fake. It was just a very primitive slowing down of a video. And the fact of a politician being portrayed as doing and saying things that he or she didn't was long-standing for women. Every prominent woman has been turned into pornography, either deep fake pornography or lookalike pornography, and yet that doesn't count as political. It's we're supposed to treat that as some private problem, an insult to us as individuals. But in fact, it is the bleeding edge of misinformation and then disinformation. Because when women are portrayed that way, it doesn't matter in what country, citizens, voters see them as morally degraded. That is not the case with men. A male politician who's sexualized often is sexualized in a way, unless he's unless he's gay or trans, he's sexualized like a woman in those cases. But a cisgendered heterosexual male politician benefits from his sexualization. That confirms what we think men are supposed to be like. And so I think that knowing what the standards are and how we keep trying to adhere to male standards of experience, male risk, male threat, male denigration, we won't be able to have women functioning in the society as equals, because we can never meet those standards. And our expectations of safety and respect get washed out. They just don't count. And so I think it's important to think about how to disrupt those standards starting in early childhood. And that has a lot to do with language, but it also has a lot to do with imagery, because we've really had a sea change in the way information is represented. It's flattened, it's decontextualized. And women, when they're harassed online, are much more likely to be harassed through memes and pornography and sexualization that's non-consensual. And so all the solutions that I've seen in institutions, in academic institutions and tech institutions, are really focused on text, and that's important, right? Like we build taxonomies of hate, and we understand we need intersectional data, but in fact, by focusing on text and not understanding the power of memes, we are eliminating a major problem that primarily affects women in media, women in politics, women in the public eye. Again, a male standard, which is the far greater likelihood of being harassed through language as opposed to imagery. And so that's the kind of, I would say, introspection that we need as individuals, but as institutions. We need to be able to hold institutions accountable for not adhering to those masculine norms and for recognizing the relevance that lived experience of being a woman, of being a Black woman, of being an Arab woman, really matters. And that has to inform and shape policy and process.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. And sorry, I forgot to bring Alan in the conversation as well. So Alan, if you can join in here. And definitely, yeah, no, I think, when in the paper, we have also talked about the importance of looking into the feminist systems change. That also means deconstructing and the standards that are put out as institutional or policy standards that are hugely masculine. And then what is the role for those who are working with boys and men when it comes to our own responsibility in looking into dismantling those standards, those systems that are built onto these sexist, misogynist ideologies on in itself, and what that means in the work we are doing. And also not to think of ICT or the space around, or the sort of the gender inequality in online spaces is very different than what we see in our daily lives. This happens in my own family. What am I doing to counter this? Because they are not so much isolated concepts on how the same ideologies are being used offline and online, and keep reinforcing each other to reinforce further and make these sexist and misogynist ideologies more stronger among the young people as well. So what am I doing at my own family level? What am I doing as individual? What am I doing in the institution I am part of? What am I doing when I be part of these policy advocacy spaces as male identified individual? How can I relate more with the feminist agenda? And looking within that as in an accountable way, and doing that again to sort of counter the kind of vision that we have set for, and counter the kind of misogynist, patriarchal, militaristic, masculine systems that are out there, which are doing more harm than everyone can think of, and looking into that as well. Not sure, Alan, sorry I brought you late in the conversation. Anything you would like to add on the practical how part?
Well, it's a fantastic conversation. It's also a bit overwhelming, to be honest. I think I'm sitting with a lot of what have we been doing all these past years that have not had much of an impact on those issues of socialization and misogynistic imagery with which we have all been raised in different ways in different societies. But just speaking personally, I'm very familiar with that in terms of my own upbringing. So the question of what to do, I think there's a kind of level of literally practice that we need to think more about. I did a great interview with Simon Murdoch from Hope Not Hate in the UK, where they do a lot of work on the far right and these kind of connections between the far right and the Manosphere. And one of the things he talked about was, in the UK in the last 10 years, there's been a massive disinvestment in youth services as part of the austerity politics of the UK, right? So, in the 70s, there were the youth workers and youth services all over the place, which are directly talking to young people, often young men, about what's going on in their lives. The last 10 years, those services have largely disappeared in many parts of the UK. So he would go into schools and have this experience of talking to young men, and would hear them repeating some of these lines straight from what they've been reading online. And he was struck by the fact that they don't have any other spaces where they can go to where they would hear anything else in a kind of deliberate way, where a youth worker who wouldn't be that different from them in age, a bit older, like an older brother really, would be talking to them about those things, like what are they hearing, what do they think about it. And we don't have the, be interesting to hear from other people who are listening as well. Like, do we have those services? Do we have those programs? I think about, and again, this is also a self-reflection and a self-criticism, right? I've been involved in writing a lot of toolkits for working with men on different aspects of masculinity. But there's something, I think there needs to be more investment in literally building the skills of people to talk to younger men about these issues. And that doesn't always mean writing it down in a toolkit, because the pace of change, like several of the discussants have said, things can be out of date very, very quickly. If I wrote something in 2019, it's already out of date, right, in terms of what it's saying about the technology. So, in a previous lifetime, I did outreach work to drug users. I would go to places to try and do needle exchange with them, right? So are we doing enough outreach work to those internet cafes where young men are sitting at laptops and then desktops and then talking to each other about what they're seeing, right? That's not about taking them through an 8-week program, blah, 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 blah. I just think too much of our emphasis in this field is on these very highly structured interventions, when what we need is more people with more skills to go and have more conversations with young men about what they're exposed to online, right? Because in some ways we're like competing for people's attention. We're in this attention economy, whether we like it or not. And there are ways of gaming the system, gaming the algorithms. And I think we can probably get smarter about how we do that as well. But like we're going to beat the casino. You aren't going to beat the casino at that. So we need to be creating these alternative connections, literally, like, how do we connect emotionally directly with people, in addition to how do we get Trump out of office, etc. How do we work for these larger, sometimes the systems change agenda is where we need to be, but it can seem a bit big and overwhelming, and I sometimes think we need to break it down a bit into specific things that we can be doing.
I also think early childhood education is vitally important, and have been for years looking for and trying to work towards ways in which, frankly, feminist men of good conscience can shape early childhood education, and at the most central and core ways. Because by the time kids are in school, so much happens already, just starting, preschool, kindergarten, first through third grade. Those are spaces that are so essential and formative. And, we talk about technology, and these kids are all digital natives. Technology is really just a handy prosthetic. It's not separate from their sense of self. And it's not, to me, about the dangers of addiction. A lot of what I see is scaremongering related to tech and sex. Tech and sex are bad. Tech and sex are not bad in and of themselves, right? This is just not the problem. I understand the problem that they have their own types of manifestations, but the problems are the attitudes we bring when we relate with tech and sex. And that starts really early. And I welcome any information, any efforts that people are doing in that space. I will share this with you all because it's kind of funny, not really, but this really struck me with my own children when they were little. They had a Smurf game, the Smurfs. Everybody knows the Smurfs, right? Pretty much. And my daughter came to me, and she was maybe 6 or 7, and she goes, I want to buy Smurfette for my game. And I was like, what do you mean? And she goes, well, I need to buy her. And I said, well, aren't you playing the game? Isn't she in the game? And she said, no, you have to buy her. And I took the game. This is a game played by 5 and 6-year-olds, and all the Smurfs were there. But if you wanted Smurfette, that was an extra, and you had to buy Smurfette to have her play. And I was like, are you kidding me? You have to buy Smurfette. I'm like, okay, well, what are you buying when you buy Smurfette? Because all these Smurfs, they have names, and some of them are virtues and some of them are vices. But basically, you were buying her sex, right? And this was for 5-year-olds. And that's what we're talking about, right? How do you have a conversation with a 5-year-old about why you might not want to buy Smurfette and why your mom's going to get ticked off and write an article about it and call the company and be a pain in the ass killjoy? But yes, that's exactly the problem. And that's happening all day, every day in classrooms everywhere.
Yeah.
Yeah, if I may add to both points and also something Sandra said before, I think there's been a lot of talk about streamlining gender, and I think that's a really important point, because as Sandra, I hope I didn't get you wrong, but as you said, and that's also something I've really experienced, especially in development discourse, when people say gender. They mean women, and there's nothing wrong with that as such. But the problem is just that it has created a culture where men, they just start looking at their phone because now we have gender sensitivity training. Oh, that's for the women. So we need to streamline that more. We need to find ways to make gender relevant for everyone, so that men also pay attention. And that also comes to, now I'm going slowly to Alan's point, because that's also what we are trying to do with Dare Gender at the moment. We are launching a project in a couple of months where we try to do more active engagement with young men about gender, and also with the people working with young men. We have these, I don't know how to translate it from Danish really, so I'll just call it social workers, but people who work like in schools and in these, especially these after school communities. How do we make gender an instrument or tool in the box that they can use when they address or when they engage with young people? And with this, I especially mean like what Alan was talking about. How can we have good conversations about gender, sexuality, about vulnerability and insecurity with especially young men? Because I think that's also one of the problems we're facing right now. If you, as a young man, want to talk about these things, there are some communities available online, and the Manosphere is one of those communities, and it's one of the communities that very specifically addresses you as a young man, addresses your insecurities, and that's a problem. How do we find good alternatives to that? And then I want to add, and this is probably maybe a slightly controversial point, so be prepared. But I also think we need to consider our own sort of role and approach, because sometimes what I have find myself doing, and I found a quote in the report as well, is that essentially what we are saying is turn down the music and stop having fun. I mean, sometimes that is what we're doing. We're saying your language is bad, you listen to the wrong music, your online behavior is bad. It's just lifting fingers all the time. And I have no idea how to work around this, but we have really turned into the new conservatives sometimes, and we need to find ways to like how do we actually do this, but without removing all the fun, because that's also why I expect. Why is it that we had especially young Danish men who start watching this guy online who he would go out and burn the Quran in the street and stuff like that, just like really extreme, insulting, radical, hateful stuff, and people start especially young men started watching this. Was it because they were all inherently racist and so on? Maybe, can't say for sure, of course, but I think they just liked that something was happening. They liked the provocation. And I mean, I've been playing a genre called black metal for 16 years now. I know what it means to provoke and how fun it could be. But I also know that you don't always think about what it means. You just like to see people's reaction and like to see the grown-ups get up in the, as we say, the red zone. Danish expression, horrible translation. Sorry about that. Anyways, but the thing is, there's so much happening. So how do we engage that? How do we address that? And how do we avoid just being the boring adult in the room, because people don't listen to the boring adult in the room?
Thank you. Anything to add, Sandra? We are around last 15 minutes now.
I just want to comment on what each of the speakers have said. So look at what you've said is really true. But also I think we need to start looking at gender in a way that when you talk about gender inclusion, gender mainstreaming, it's not just about numbers, but what is the impact it's creating on both women and men, their communities. And then also I wanted to also add on what Shoya said. She mentioned something very important about system. System is something that is very something that we need to look into consideration as we talk about engaging men and women. If we are talking about addressing the system, and yet the policies, the practices, and sometimes the ideas and the beliefs have been done by men alone, how do we then include the women? Because there is a lot of like for the case of Uganda has been like voted as one of the countries the best ICTs, laws and policies, but realize that as women of Uganda and other women's rights online activists in Uganda and other parts of the world, we have been putting in submission to ensure that these policies are not just general, but they're talking about addressing specific issues that we see today on affecting women's rights, men's rights online. So there's a need, as Alan said, that we really need to start looking into the practical aspect, doing a lot of digital security trainings, online safety trainings for women and men. And that is also brings me to what usually is said, that you cannot really fix using the law what has really been broken by technology. So we really need to start thinking of having a practical bit of how do we then move into the aspect of engaging more men into the narrowing the gender digital divide that exists online. And also, yes, talking about also the aspect of the practical bit, yes, it's very important for us to start having discussions, not even, I think, right at school, but I think for me still it goes back to the mother and the father having these tips at their hand, so that then when they give birth to their kids, they are able to socialize these kids to understand some of the issues that already exist, and not have this traditional mindset that, oh, I'm not supposed to say this to this child is young. And yet these kids will grow up and they will start facing these challenges in the community. And when it's too late for them to maybe change their mindset, they've learned so many perspectives from school already. So I think this is something that is also very important for us to put into consideration. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. So yeah, amazing. I think there are so many food for thoughts for the work we are doing. And now, thank you, colleagues who have started putting in your own reflections and on the chat box as well. And yeah, I think there is a lot of appreciation from the participants on what has been said. And I think there are points around why women would retract from being, engaging with online system because of the online hegemony of sexism is there, and abuse and of that, and why women themselves decide to pull out from engaging too much. And there is also a comment around how faith also brings an important conversation in this space as well, and how young people should be involved in looking at how faith is informing their ideologies, how faith plays an important role on their own identities. And also, it's really important to also think about, when we talk about the work with boys and men, not to isolate boys and men from the broader society, but also think of how can we bring girls into this conversation, and sort of from an empowerment perspective, but also from an accountability perspective for young men when they are having this conversation, relate to the lived experiences of young girls or girls and women, so that they can really understand and build empathy around what is happening, and the sensitivity that it brings in the lives of women and girls and people of gender non-conforming ideologies, and what that means in how that impacts their lives. But also to look at how can we sensitize people in, more engage them in creatively and creating new and attractive entertainment for young generation, and that's something, since especially they are quite, my child is now entering into teenage, and he always keeps on saying, I'm bored, I'm bored, I'm bored. If he is not in mobile, then the next, in a couple of seconds, you'll have, I'm bored. What should I do? And then if you hand them, they are into this business, and everything that is revolving them and entertaining them is the online platform. What on then brings to the music industry is I think why the way we need to understand is also it's not only about the song, the popularity that also is related to the visualization in the song itself, and in most cases, unfortunately, is highly sexist objectification of women's body in those songs. So if you give only give the audio, it may not be as popular, but the objectification on itself and how men and boys are socialized to sort of relate to the objectification that happens also brings a different dynamics, and that's something we really need to. So there is no issues with songs and music, but also more and more we are saying, as Suraya, you were saying, objectification that happens, and Sandra, you were saying the lack of consent in the use of pictures and projecting them is a bigger issue. And I think in Sweden, not sure, Loke, if you are aware of, in Sweden, Suraya, Sweden started doing this experiment in kindergarten schools with teachers by integrating gender as one of the key area. And they were doing some experiment when I was there. And I haven't really followed up on what really came out from that experiment. But there was that effort. We're working with this preschool kids and students of those kids in the school on the issues of gender, and how can that impact on the ideologies that is put forward from the early childhood and education as well. So there were these, but yeah, a huge area that still needs to be invested in is ECD area, and also look at how can we engage early as much as possible before these ideologies around gender are already set. So it's really important. And the last point before we round up today is to the point on systems change. So just to clarify, when we talk about feminist systems change agenda, it is not to mean that everyone will have to do everything. And that's what we try to do as MenEngage Alliance, as a social change network, is to bring people from different expertise and ideas and areas of work they are doing and connect them together so that we can get support from each other, but also reinforce what we are doing each other, so that all the contributions and achievements we have been making in our small corners can connect to become bigger influencer in the bigger platform. And I think that's what the feminist systems change is all about. So yes, it may sound a little bit overwhelming, but it doesn't really mean you have to start doing new things from a system change. Whatever you do, connect with someone else who is maybe doing the same effort with the same vision, but at a slightly different level, so that you don't feel overwhelmed. And there is a sense of solidarity and commonness, because we are so, in a way, smaller groups, and creating that space. And that's what MenEngage tries to do, is to create that space as a community of practice for all of us to come together and reinforce each other's work as much as possible, but doing that in a very accountable way. So mindful of being that. And that's one of the biggest challenges in the development sector too. So with that, I wanted to again give maybe half minute or so, or 1 minute maximum, to each four of you to share your key reflection or key message or take away from today's conversation. This is probably a very difficult ask, but if you can, and if I may, you will have 30 seconds to say what is the key message or takeaway from the two conversations that we have had today.
I'll jump in again.
Please.
Well, first of all, I really just want to thank you for the work that you do. Thank you for bringing us all here. I learned so much. It was a pleasure. Honestly, it's hard to find 2 hours in a solid block like this. And I really appreciated the ability to have a more substantive conversation. But I'm going to really reinforce what we've all said. But Sandra said this repeatedly, and I'm just going to double down on this. We need men, obviously. It's why you do the work you do. We need to hold men accountable. We do need to hold women who also live in the culture and are sometimes deeply, deeply sexist and misogynistic, which affects men in many ways. But men have power. They have control over the media, over technology. They have power that they have the power to disrupt in ways that women still don't. And I think it's important to acknowledge that. And we are often, I know that I'm often in rooms, which I think happens to all of us, that are filled with women, as though we're supposed to fix this problem by ourselves. And that will never work. So I also just want to reiterate the importance of finding ways to build truly inclusive spaces to hold people with power accountable, because I think we do need to do that, but also to create new spaces. I think this is important too. And I think Loke talked about this, but to give alternatives, you know, when even for small children, you take something away, you give them something, literally, you know, you don't just create a vacuum, because this kind of horrible extremism and violence that I make no distinction in terms of online or off, it thrives in that vacuum. And so I agree that we need to find healthy alternatives that allow men and boys to say, that's just not cool. We're just not doing that anymore. Like, let's do this other thing instead, because that's really not happening. So thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you, sir. Who would like to go next?
I can go next. So I think in a way what we are saying, I've said Laxman and Shoya, is kind of different. For me, my major big takeaway from what all speakers have been saying, I think, is majorly for us to build a community of practice. Imagine all of us in this webinar, we have come together to advocate for a cause that we would want to see. Imagine what we would do together. It would really be great work. So I would say that for me, I really emphasize the aspect of coming together, women's movement, MenEngage, coming together to fight for a gender transformative work and justice that we want to see in the community. And also, as we do that, we really need to realize not only the gender difference that exists in the online community, but also we need to start now looking at the class solidarity that exists in different communities. So that is all from me. Thank you.
Alan, why don't you go? Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. This was the biggest task of the day to sum everything up. So well done to my colleagues. Hard to follow, but I would say building networks, continuing these conversations and sharing ideas, and especially this sharing of ideas across borders, I find very useful and very interesting, because as we said during the conversation, that's what we're seeing right now, that people are sharing and exchanging ideas across borders. We're seeing immense inspiration coming from specific countries to other countries, and to keep track we need to understand what is going on. And I think that's maybe one last point I will stress, that I don't know if we talked so much about that. Well, I guess in a sense everything we talk about is about that, but understanding why these communities are attractive. So when we talk about attention economies, I mean, attention is attention to something specific. So of course that doesn't happen in a vacuum either. That doesn't happen in an empty space. Why is this creating the attention and the emotions that it's creating? I can imagine that if we had another hour, we all had good ideas about why that is, but I think it's an important point to really understand why.
Yeah.
That's it.
Thank you.
Yes, thanks everyone. It's fantastic conversation, very rich. I think we need to make more media. I love what Soraya said about, we need to be thinking much more in terms of visual culture and not just the text. And again, like I write texts all the time, right? Like MenEngage produces texts. I think we need to get better at producing lots of different kinds of media, and that really moves people, right? I think, we can learn from the climate justice work, I think, and really connect with that, about connecting to other visions of ways of living together. So gender is part of a broader vision about other ways of living together. And, I know MenEngage has put out a youth strategy. We need to be connecting with and being led by and drawing on the creative energies and passions of young people much more than we are, I think. So, but thanks again. That was tremendous.
Great, amazing. Cannot thank you all more for such a great conversation. Really, it really brought some key elements that we need to think moving forward.